So hopefully you can all see that. And maybe I'll be able to actually present it in a second. We'll see. All right, so virtue ethics is a very intuitive approach in many ways, because it seems to reflect a fairly basic way of our understanding of morality, which is assessing whether somebody is a good or bad person. So the way that we've looked at up to now is that we've been looked at whether actions are good or bad. So utilitarianism and moral rules, and to some extent dignity, although dignity does take us a little bit more into virtue ethics, but certainly moral rules are they're about particular actions, right? Whether you should do something at a particular time. And they're not really assessing whether somebody is a good or a bad person. But virtue ethics is particularly talking about whether people are good or bad. And basically its central idea is that we should aim to be good people, to be virtuous people, and we should avoid vices. So while utilitarianism came out of the 19th century, especially England, and the moral rules approach, and especially the dignity idea, came out of the 18th century, virtue ethics is far older. It's thousands of years old, and in some ways it seems to be more culturally diverse. It seems to fit with a lot of different cultures. It is especially associated with the approach of Aristotle. Although, I mean, he was the one who really kind of set it out. He had a book called the Nicomachean Ethics, and he set out his moral theory, and we'll look at some of his views in this. All right. Now, the big difficulty or big question for anybody who wants to defend virtue ethics is like, well, okay, great. What virtues do you want to say are the best ones? And you know, if you go to Google and type in list of virtues, you get 222 million results. So clearly there are different people have different views about this. And the virtue, there is one of the top results is virtues list from Virtues for Life. And you'll see that that has a sort of surprising list of virtues. I mean, some of them you can see in that alphabetical list in the middle there. There's acceptance, assertiveness, authenticity, but then you get to beauty. And so it seems that according to that, beauty would be a virtue. Well, that seems a surprising idea. I mean, we may admire beauty, but we don't think of beauty normally as a moral quality. Then you also on that list, you'll see cleanliness. And I definitely appreciate cleanliness. I was on the subway yesterday next to somebody who maybe lacked some cleanliness. And I was definitely thinking, oh, I would prefer it if they used some soap and water. But I mean, maybe we were to think of that as a kind of moral virtue. But it's not the sort of moral virtue we normally think about. And then the list goes on to include things like joyfulness, which I'm not quite sure. I mean, I guess it means that somebody is full of joy. exactly what that means to be full of joy. I guess it means that it's not just that they're happy all the time, but somehow they're really sort of extremely happy. They really find joy in the world. So that there's something about responding to the world in a very positive way. And that's, I mean, again, maybe that is admirable. It is kind of nice to be around people like that, although not necessarily for a long time, because I find it, personally, I find it kind of tiring to be around somebody like that. You know, like I like things a little more low key. But you know, we can definitely see something good about joyfulness. And then another item in that list is unity, which I guess we would require some further explanation. But I mean, I guess it's as opposed to disunity. So maybe that means you have like some sort of unity among your different desires and your beliefs and your values, so that everything sort of fits together, rather than being all over the place and being torn in different directions. So there's a big question then about what kind of virtues would count as moral virtues, and what do we want to kind of come, what kind of list we want to have. You'll see on that page too, they're like, people have, there's debates about how many virtues there are. Is it hundreds, thousands, 52, 12, 100, or 16? It just seems that it's going to be a little arbitrary, no matter what answer we give. I think one contrast I like a lot is between the Homeric virtues and the Christian virtues. So you may or may not have studied Homer and his works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they reflect ancient Greek values. And in those writings, you get Homeric virtues. And the basic idea then is that to be virtuous back in those times meant you were born into a noble family. You had wealth, you had physical strength, you were good in battle. Obviously, that requires that you, both physical strength and being good in battle require that you be a man. Women didn't fight in battle. Although maybe that's not entirely true. There were the Amazons, so, but then maybe there's some exceptions. And then there's honor. And honor requires having other people's respect. So to be virtuous is not just your internal qualities, but it's these external things like being respected by other people and having material goods and having power over other people. And Odysseus in Homer is famous for being cunning. And so that idea is, I mean, often we don't necessarily think of being cunning, being crafty, it's more like being sneaky, right? So it's an ability to trick people. So we don't necessarily kind of think that's always so admirable, but the ancient Greeks, they kind of liked it. And to be honest, I think we kind of like it sometimes too. So that's the ancient Greek values, the virtues. And then there is Christianity. And obviously there's all sorts of forms of Christianity. But here's what they say about the 7 virtues in Wikipedia. There's prudence, which is a kind of carefulness. And then there's justice. It's a little bit vague what justice is. Generally, we think it's something to do with being fair, especially with the distribution of goods, but it may be a bit wider than that in Christianity. Then there's temperance, which is being moderate, not indulging yourself too much. And then there's courage. So those are the 4 cardinal virtues. And then there are the 3 theological virtues of faith, which is presumably to be kind of faithful to God, hope, presumably is about being hopeful about the future, and then charity is being charitable towards others. So a very different set of virtues than the ancient Greeks. So a central question for us is, well, is one set of virtues right? Are they both wrong? Do we want to say, well, in 21st century New York, we're going to have a totally different set of virtues? Or even are virtues going to vary from group to group or person to person? And not just what the virtues they actually believe in, but what virtues we think are actually important for our society. Aristotle wrote a lot about the virtues, and there is this page here, I think, is interesting because it lists the virtues. It also helps to explain how he thought about virtues. They're all about kind of spheres or action and feeling. So there's courage and temperance, which you see in Christianity too. But then there's liberality, magnificence, magnanimity, which is, I guess, being generous to others people's faults, being sort of forgiving. There's proper ambition and proper pride, being patient, having a good temper, truthfulness, wittiness, friendliness, modesty, and righteous indignation. And for each of these, he thinks that they are in between an excess and a deficiency. So courage, having a lack of courage is cowardice, but you can have what you might think of as too much courage. There's that would be rashness, where you just have no sort of self-control at all, and you're just inviting danger. And then, so, I mean, similarly with truthfulness. So apparently here you have, I mean, you might think, well, the deficiency of truthfulness would be being a liar, but here that doesn't seem quite right. It says understatement or mock modesty is the deficiency of it, which is a little bit confusing, but we won't worry about that. But and then, so maybe it's not so much about just being truthful all the time, but rather it's about talking about yourself. And then there's boastfulness, which is especially it's definitely about yourself. So you can be truthful, but if all you're talking about is how great you are, then that isn't necessarily so great. My favorite Aristotelian virtue is wittiness, because I don't think any other moral philosopher has really emphasized having a sense of humor. But it does seem actually to be quite an important thing. So I think Aristotle is onto something. As somebody who lacks a sense of humor, I mean, it's not totally impossible for them to be kind of a good citizen, but it's definitely harder. It's harder to get along with other people. And then the deficiency of wittiness is to be be boorish, just to go on, drone on, maybe as I'm doing, and then to have too much humor is to be a buffoon, just to be joking all the time. All right, so those are Aristotle's virtues, and certainly they can't be easily dismissed. There is something interesting about them, although we also want to have them explained a bit more. Okay, so that's Aristotle. All right, so Aristotle's basic idea and how he kind of came up with this list was he was thinking about people live in a city-state. He lived in ancient Athens. And so basically he thinks that virtues are related to which community you're living in. And he's thinking about what virtues you should have in order for your community to thrive. So actually, Aristotle is not really an individualist. He is saying that We should always do what's good for our community. So, I mean, in some ways, it's a little bit like utilitarianism, but I guess one of his central ideas is that he thinks that that's the nature of human beings is to be a social creature, and social creatures do best when we're doing what's good for our group. So he doesn't think there's a conflict between what's doing good for us and doing what's good for your group, because you're going to thrive when you're doing what basically you were meant to do. And so there is a sort of similarity between his view of humans and that of a beehive or an ant colony. The idea is everybody should be doing their own, having their own role, and the roles are pretty much predetermined. So if the idea is that your role is predetermined, then the virtues you should have are going to be related to your role in life. So there may also be some variation from group of people to group of people, depending on what role you have. Clearly, if you're in the military, then courage is going to be the most important virtue. But not everybody is in the military. And if you're not in the military, then maybe, suppose you are a politician, you're running. I mean, courage is going to be relevant, but maybe being kind of thoughtful and being far-sighted are going to be better or more important virtues to have. And if you are a farmer, then having skills which are good at farming, and if you're in business, being kind of trustworthy and not cheating people, those are going to be the most important virtues to have. So there can be some variation according to what your role is in society. And he thought that, like I just said, that if you do live your life well, and if you flourish according to how you should, what your destiny or your role in society should be, then he thought you would be happy. So he doesn't think that anybody can be anything. Like in the US, sometimes people say, well, any American can be president, but he thinks, no, that's not right. Different people have different roles in society, and that's basically part of their biology. And he also thinks that some people are born to have crummy lives. They're going to be in poverty, and they're going to be sort of, well, I guess one crummy life to have is to be a slave. So if you're a slave or if you're in poverty, then you're never going to have any virtue, because that's not a good life to have. So some people are lucky, they're born into good lives, and some people are unlucky, are born into bad lives. So then he thinks some people can never actually be happy. Now, obviously someone like Aristotle is highly controversial, and basically we all disagree with him now, because he thought that some people their role was to be slaves. And similarly, he thought that men and women were not just profoundly different, but that women were secondary to men. He said like women were kind of deficient men. And that means that he didn't think that women could have honor. So we want to kind of reject all that. But then we need to look at other theories. Other theories tend to have a more sort of narrow view of what being virtuous is, and they say that anybody can be virtuous. It's all a matter of just your own personal qualities. So whether you're born into poverty or you're born into a rich family makes no difference. It's just a matter of how you develop yourself and you develop your own qualities. He did think, well, everybody thinks really, just about in virtue ethics, that it's one of your important responsibilities in life is to improve yourself, to make yourself better by working on your virtues. So he doesn't think you're totally fixed in how courageous you are, or how funny you are, or how magnanimous you are. you can get better at those things by practice. So he definitely thinks that we know we need to bring up children to be virtuous and train them to be virtuous. And as we go on in life, we need to inspect our lives and see where we're lacking and actually try and make ourselves more virtuous. That is a big ask, and we might even look at empirical evidence and ask, well, how much can people really change their own character? If you set out to become more courageous, if you set out to become more truthful, is that possible? Sometimes people say, well, that's what psychotherapy can help with, that if you work on yourself in therapy, then you can become a better person. Sometimes people have like sort of dramatic kind of transformations. They have crises, and then they inspect their lives and they turn themselves around, so they become better people. So certainly anecdotally, we hear quite a lot of that, this idea that people can really change themselves. And obviously people can be changed by outside influences. The most obvious kind of change is negative. Sometimes people go through terrible experiences and they react in negative ways. They become bitter and mean and violent, right? So it's certainly possible to change people for the worse through bad experiences. We might wonder, maybe not now, but in the future, whether it would be possible to develop new medications or new drugs, which would able to transform people's personalities, to make them better people. That would be an interesting idea. We might sort of feel like, oh, that's cheating to like just take a drug. But if it changes your personality for the better, then maybe cheating or not, it might be a good idea to do it. So there is a lot of emphasis on the idea on trying to become a better person. An important thing to notice about the virtues is that they're very closely linked to emotion. So, I mean, courage is a good example. So to be courageous is not to never have any fear. Rather, to be courageous is to experience fear and then overcome that fear and act in a good way despite the dangers. And if somebody doesn't experience any fear and they're completely oblivious to all the dangers, then they're not courageous. They're something else. Maybe they are just lucky, but depending on, I mean, if they actually kind of do good things, that's great. But we don't think being courageous is not having any fear and just kind of blindly kind of going ahead without any worries. Rather, being courageous is about really experiencing fear and then overcoming it. So fear is very essential to our understanding of what courage is. And the idea of being a virtuous person is to have a kind of a love of the good things, a love of good qualities, to really respect good qualities, to react positively to those things, and to react negatively to bad qualities and cases of evil and vices. So somebody who is honest should be devoted to honesty, and they would have a strong kind of visceral dislike of honesty. Lying would sort of make them feel sick. Right? So what it is to be virtuous is to really have your whole character built around the virtues, and your whole emotional makeup to be based around them. It's not just about what you do, it's about your emotional reactions to the world. If you do bad, then you should feel guilt. and that should change your behavior. So guilt should be a good motivation to then becoming a better person. So then you're doing the right actions for the right reasons because you passionately believe they're the right thing to do. That's not just a matter of like going through the motions, not just a matter of following rules. It's really a matter of a real belief and commitment to the right things. So all that stuff about virtue ethics is really kind of powerful and convincing. On the other hand, there are kind of some issues with virtue ethics, and we need to think about what the kind of problems are. To say a little bit more about Aristotle, it is worth mentioning he distinguishes the intellectual virtues from the moral or ethical virtues. So we talked about the temperance and courage and so on, those are the ethical ones, but he does say there are theoretical ones, the reasoning, being good at practical stuff and being good at kind of highly intellectual stuff, those are different sorts of virtues. Although clearly they are going to be related to each other, that if you're good at reasoning, then that may help you be a good moral person in some ways or carry out better actions. Aristotle spends a lot of time in his work analyzing how people fail to be virtuous, how they kind of give in to temptation, or they are overcome by their negative emotions. So somebody who is a coward would be overcome by fear and would just not do the courageous thing. They would do the cowardly thing because of their emotions. So he spends a lot of time talking about how people end up failing to do the right thing because of their character flaws. Okay. As I've mentioned, Aristotle thinks that women are defective men, and their roles in society should be very limited. He also thought that some people were just naturally suited to being slaves. Again, we completely disagree with that. And he was a tutor to Alexander the Great, who went on to conquer huge portions of the world. I'm not sure that Alexander the Great needed a lot of kind of teaching from Aristotle about how to kind of justify himself, but clearly if he's taught by somebody who believes in slavery, and this is a society which totally believes in slavery, then it would seem then that Aristotle's approach fits pretty well with this idea that you should go out and conquer the rest of the world. And we might see that as especially problematic. And as we've seen, he thinks that if you can only really be virtuous if you're born into a wealthy family. It seems to imply that the lower classes are not going to be capable of being virtuous or happy. And again, we might find that, we probably do find that highly problematic. As I mentioned, it definitely seems on Aristotle's view, and maybe lots of virtue ethics, that which virtues you should have will depend on what your job is, what your role is in life. Aristotle and a lot of the ancient Greeks thought that what your role in life was pretty much set by your circumstances, and especially your family. So if you're born into a rich family, then you probably go into become a politician, and you will be busy kind of ruling the city-state. If you're the son of a soldier, then you'll probably be a soldier yourself. If you're the son of a merchant, you'll probably be a merchant yourself. If you're the son of a farmer, you'll be a farmer yourself. So your role is pretty much set by your lineage. And obviously, if you're a woman, then you're going to be a mother. All women should be mothers in this sort of view. Definitely, it would seem like that in order to get on with other people, in order for a community to exist, you have to have the ability to actually kind of have social relationships. and be a good citizen. So that's going to influence what shared values there should be. Okay. The virtue ethics people want to distinguish themselves from people who believe in moral rules. Moral rules, the moral rules view, although as we've talked about, is not necessarily very easy to work out, because there are going to be plenty of cases where there are conflicts between rules, for example. Still, it seems like it's a moral rules view is going to guiding behavior in a pretty straightforward way. While Aristotle and a lot of virtue ethics people aren't really aiming to kind of guide behavior. They're not giving rules. They're just saying that a virtuous person will know what to do. So there's a big question about, like, it's not really the theory itself, which is meant to be guiding people's behavior. Rather, the idea is you need to become a virtuous person, then you'll know what to do. So if we're trying to think about using virtue ethics, it's only really going to be useful if you not only use it, but you are yourself a virtuous person. As a virtuous person, you will know what to do. So it doesn't seem like this theory is actually action guiding, because it doesn't have rules. It doesn't have any way to kind of calculate what the right thing to do is. It just says, be a virtuous person, then you'll know what to do. There's no way we can crank out the answers to moral problems. So it does seem actually less useful than the other views in giving a guide to how to behave. Although, as I've pointed out previously, even the other theories, utilitarianism and the dignity theory, the kind of list of moral rules approach, often that's also not actually very helpful, because there's a lot of questions to be asked, and it's a sort of arbitrariness and lack of enough detail of knowledge to really know what the right answer is. So for a lot of moral theories, it's actually going to be pretty hazy what we should do. But virtue ethics may be even more hazy than the other approaches. Now, even if it's not very clear to what we should do, still we want a list of virtues. And I talked a little bit about how Aristotle says the virtues we should have are the ones that are going to be good for a city-state, good for a certain community. But still, I mean, that's fine if we can work out what virtues those are. It may actually be quite difficult to work out what those virtues should be. It's not actually that clear what the virtues should be. I mean, if we knew what virtues we should have, then maybe it would be very obvious how to raise kids. But people have different views about how to raise kids. So, and I guess the other thing to say is, he was living in ancient Athens, something like 2,400 years ago. Now here we are living in New York in the 2020s, and it's going to be a very different sort of question about how to make society thrive. And we might even scratch our heads and think, well, what does that mean for our society to thrive? Does that mean for everybody to be making lots of money, or for there to be kind of some increased happiness index? What exactly would that be? Would it be for the United States or New York to gain dominance over other people? Clearly, that was part of the Greek idea, that thriving meant to be dominating other groups. So there's difficult questions about how should we try to implement virtue ethics now, even if it was straightforward for Aristotle. It's actually pretty hard for other people. All right, that's better. Okay. Another thing to say about virtue ethics is that it's much more focused on people's individual lives about in terms of how to raise people, and maybe kind of thinking about what characteristics you should have. It doesn't tell us very much about social policy. So it's not impossible, but it's pretty hard to work out what levels of taxation we should have using virtue ethics, or should we make abortion legal or illegal? It's not at all clear how you would use virtue ethics to answer those sorts of questions, because those are sort of social questions, and virtue ethics is much more about living your own personal life. So it seems to be sort of limited in that way. So, and then if you're trying to apply it to particular kind of social questions, like should there be factory farming, should we allow abortion, what forms of punishment should there be, it doesn't really provide a lot of guidance to those questions. We can ask what Aristotle would say, but that doesn't really give us a lot of answers. Okay, so that's virtue ethics. Let me move and say something about natural law theory, which is also somewhat associated with Aristotle. So it is not incompatible with virtue ethics, but it is kind of a different emphasis, and is especially associated with some Christian theologians, especially Thomas Aquinas. All right. So I find natural law theory pretty hazy. I mean, the basic idea is clearly associated with Christianity, but many natural law theorists want to say their theory is not linked to any particular religious belief. The idea is basically that there are natural laws in the world, and we can know what they are, and those natural laws are about how we should live, or about what is valuable. But I do find natural law theories like, well, okay, that's all great, but how do you know what's right? And I find it pretty mysterious how they come up with their values. It's still true that most people who defend a natural law theory tend to be Catholics, and often they are employed by Catholic universities. But at least in theory, it's possible to separate natural law theory from any religious belief or any belief in God. It's simply an idea about the nature of the world, that everything has a kind of certain way of being which we should promote. So there's these ideas of rationality, and there's assumptions that if you're rational enough, then you're going to know the right answers. And that's great. And we've seen that assumption with other people, but then there's further questions about, well, how do you know what true rationality is? And that is a sort of a big question. It seems hard to give non-question begging answers. All right, so natural law, the basic idea is that there are some good things in the universe. So this idea that we have a natural purpose, a telos, and our nature gives us our purpose. So we should pursue life and procreation and society and reasonable conduct. That's a good list. Aquinas didn't actually give us anything more than that. You might wonder whether that's enough, but Aquinas didn't say. So the idea that life is valuable, that seems great. I mean, Aristotle Aristotle seemed to agree with that. Utilitarianism values all animal life because that's also a potentially source of pleasure. The dignity view values especially human life because it's a source of rationality, although as we saw that when you think about dignity, maybe we would want to extend dignity to non-humans too. And then the natural law view seems to value just human life and human life for itself. So it's kind of close to the dignity view. It's not quite the same thing. So the natural law view is close to the idea that people think that human life is sacred. Now, the whole idea of sacred is definitely very religious. Dignity is not a religious idea necessarily. Now, if the natural law theorists want to say that life is valuable, then we want to know, well, what way is life valuable? How does it connect to the world? If you can't say that it's just sacred because that's a religious idea, and they want to say that their ideas are not necessarily religious. So it leaves a sort of question, well, what's the source of value of human life? All right, so definitely natural law is a view which relies on a list of goods. And as we've seen with a moral rules view, you want to work out, well, what's the list? And if you say there's a list, give us the list. Similarly, with virtue ethics, it says, well, there's a list of virtues. Okay, what's the list of virtues? So with natural law, we want to know what is naturally and universally good. And the basic idea is that it comes from our purpose or telos. It helps us flourish. Again, that whole idea of flourishing seems pretty up in the air. Well, how do we know what we mean by flourishing? And he's talking about nature. Aquinas himself, like many of these other philosophers, was totally sexist. He approves of Aristotle's view that the female is a misbegotten male. And Aquinas says that women are defective and misbegotten. And he thinks that females are inherently subordinate to males. So Aquinas' view is that women's purpose in life is to do what men tell them, or at least to do what is good for men. He says, so by such a subjection, woman is naturally subject to man, because in man, the discretion of reason predominates. So the idea is, well, men have rationality, women don't. So women are should be like slaves. They should be treated as not fully human, and therefore men should rule over them. That doesn't mean men should abuse them. The idea is that men should do what is good for women, but the assumption is that women can't really live their own lives by themselves because they don't have the rationality. Now, obviously, you can be a natural law theorist without buying into that idea of the nature of women. But certainly we're looking to Aquinas to illuminate us on what's naturally good. We may feel somewhat suspicious about how reliable a guide he's going to be when he has this view of women. And then he has kind of complicated views about slavery. He's not necessarily completely pro-slavery, but he's not necessarily against it either. And he thinks there are natural slaves, people who should be enslaved because they can't run their own lives, and so they're better off in the service of a master who aims to treat his slave well for their mutual benefit. But he also says that nothing is so repugnant to human nature as slavery, and therefore there is no greater sacrifice, except that of life, which one man can make for another than to give himself up for bondage for the sake of another. So his view about slavery is complicated, but I mean, you might be hoping that he would say, no, slavery is totally bad. He doesn't say that. He seems to say that it's okay under some circumstances. And he writes, a son as such belongs to his father, and a slave as such belongs to his master. Yet each considered as a man is something having separate existence and distinct from others. Hence, insofar as each of them is a man, there is justice towards them in a way. For this reason, too, there are certain laws regulating the father to his son and of a master to his slave. But insofar as each is something belonging to another, the perfect idea of right or just is wanting to them. So his views of, I mean, it's interesting, his views of being a father and son. You think there's this idea that the son is in some sense a slave to the father. So, I mean, there's a lot going on with his ideas of slavery, and we should, but I think basically we can be pretty sure that we don't necessarily agree with his views altogether. Okay, now to just say a little bit more about the natural law view, as you might guess, there's going to be all sorts of different lists of offered. And here on this slide, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lists of what are meant to be the natural goods. And you'll see that they are pretty different. Some people include playful activities, as Grisey does, and Finnish has play too. Chappelle doesn't seem to have play, but he does have physical and mental health and harmony. Murphy has play. He also has inner peace. He includes religion as a natural good. I'm not sure that everybody would agree that religion is an intrinsic good about in the world, but he says it is. And so, I mean, there's different ways of dividing things up. You might say, well, it doesn't make much difference what list you have, it all comes to the same. But if you're trying to actually promote your theory, you should be pretty clear what your theory is, and how do we decide about who's right about their list? Okay. All right. So there's also a question about, like, to what extent are these natural goods, these universal goods, actually universal? Do we really think that they apply to all societies for all times? It seems like, well, if you're going to make that claim, you really have to justify it. And we haven't seen any justifications. There's a kind of big questions then about what theories should we have? I think one comment that many people have made, especially David Hume, but others have made this too, is that to go from something is natural to that something is good is a big leap. Arsenic is natural, but arsenic is not necessarily good. Washing machines are unnatural. Maybe clothing is unnatural, but we tend to think that washing machines and clothing, and we might include our phones, they're not natural either, but we might also say they are good. So there's a big question about how to make that connection between what's natural and what's good. Then there's this question about, what do we mean by natural? Is it just something to do with our kind of living naturally, living in the forest, our evolutionary past? Are people who live in small tribes in the Amazon forest, are they living the most natural life? Is our life very unnatural, where people drive cars and get on trains and use all this technology? You need to say a lot more about what counts as natural and what's unnatural. There's some troubling ideas that if you look at higher apes, and you even look at human society, you might say that rape is a natural thing, that in a lot of primate societies, rape happens. So if that's a sort of natural thing, then should we say that rape is good? Well, that would be a terrible thing to say. So we need to be very careful about what we mean by natural and how we try to work that out. All right, so I think that's as much as I want to say about natural law right now, but it gives you some of the main issues. Okay, let me say goodbye to you. And if anybody has any further questions, you can definitely ask them. But I'm done for now, and I will see you next week at 11 a.m. Okay, I'm done.